Sharpen, Masters of Surgical Education.
This is Samuel George, consultant plastic surgeon. This video is on how to design bilateral advancement flaps, or the H flap, which it is more popularly known as. Now, if we think about flap classification and look at the 5 C's, contour, composition, circulation, contiguity, and conditioning, what we're talking about here is contour. Now, what contour is the method in which the donor moves to the recipient. Now, there's 4 main ways this can happen. It could be through transposition, interpolation, rotation, or advancement. And what we're talking about here is advancement. Now, simply put, advancement is actually very simple. You have a defect, you cut a square out, you design a flap adjacent to the defect by extending 2 parallel lines, and then you advance this flap into the defect. Now, this sounds very simple, but there are a few nuances to think about. The first one is, what is the size of the defect, and how long a flap do you need to actually cover or resurface the entire defect? Now, comfortably to cover the whole defect, you will need to actually design a flap which is 2 times the length of your actual length of defect. But there are other things to think about, like where you are in the body in terms of the width to length ratio and flap vascularity. We can also design Burroughs triangles to encourage the flap to advance further and prevent dog ears at the base of the flap. Now, if we move this flap to the forehead where it's commonly used, you might see that designing a flap which is 2 times the length of the defect might result in a very long flap, and you think you might compromise the vascularity to the tip of the flap depending on how wide the flap is. So in order to mitigate this problem, what you can do is design 2 flaps on the contralateral sides of the actual defect and basically halve the length of these flaps. So now if your flap is X, it is the same as your defect being X, and you have X on both sides of the flaps as well. So your flaps are the same size as your defect, but you've got 2 of them instead of 1 flap, which is 2 times X. So what you're doing now is you've reduced the length to breadth ratio of your flap, improved the vascularity. Now both these flaps will advance in the opposing directions and close your defect. So each flap closes half your defect, and your resultant scar is the shape of an H, and that's why the flap is called an H flap. Now, there are a few nuances to think about. The first one, like I have been mentioning, is the length to breadth ratio, and that will determine how well your flap is vascularized. Depending on which part of the body you're in, limbs need a shorter or a smaller length to breadth ratio, whereas on the face you can go quite high, and some places say 1 to 6 to maintain blood supply to the flap, but I would just keep it at 1 to 2 as a maximum to encourage good vascularity of your flaps. The other thing you think about if you perform these flaps on the forehead is the supratrochlear nerve is sitting right in the middle of the forehead, and the supraorbital nerve is right next to it. So if you're raising these flaps, you have to be very aware of these nerves so you don't damage them and cause numbness in the forehead or neuromas, which can cause frontal headaches. Now, these flaps move better if they're raised in the subgaleal plane, and these are where the nerves are more at risk of being damaged. So just be aware of these nerves when you're raising the flaps. And this is how you do an H flap. Thank you.
Sharpen, Masters of Surgical Education.